In the West, we use the DMS-5 as a diagnostic manual for psychological issues. And trauma, PTSD, is in the DMS-5, but that only deals with one-time large traumatic events. There's well-known studies and since the 90s, and then with all the new neuroscience, that there is a thing called complex PTSD or complex trauma, or sometimes people call it developmental trauma, which is close to what I'm talking about with a trauma complex. But it's not accepted in the DMS-5, even though has the most dynamic studies, and especially in the neurosciences, as actually being a real thing. And it's just, for some reason, it's not being put into the DMS-5, and they just updated it last year. Actually, I believe it was last year. They updated it last year, and they still refuse to put it in. And those updates are like every decade or so. And so they refuse to put it in. Now, in Europe, in their diagnostic manual, they have complex trauma. So complex trauma is different because it's not like like a building blows up in front of you. Complex trauma is developmental. So when there are developmental parts of the brain that are happening in childhood, they get distorted. They physiologically get damaged by not having the what we would consider the appropriate environment for it to grow and thrive in, because your brain's actually growing from 2/3 of its size from 0 to 5. So there's parts of the brain that are not even there, that are developing, and they develop in context of relationship with the caregivers and the environment. So if that is distorted in any ways, the damage is very, we can predict what will happen, but that's not acknowledged in the DMS-5. What tends to happen is that we just look at the symptoms that people are having, and then we have these diagnoses that capture the symptoms, and then that's why you have to have multiple diagnoses, because there's no one. They're not dealing with the root of it, which is most of the time is a trauma complex or complex trauma. The reason I have to use trauma complex is because even the understanding of the new neuroscience is they're not interpreting the data in a way that's actually has any meaningful results. So they can say, yes, there's a developmental trauma or trauma or complex trauma that happens through childhood, a constant threat to the person of the child developmentally, and it creates trauma complexes, which we'll get into. But the modern way, even if you were to deal with people who understand, like Gabor Mate, Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, these people understand the neuroscience of complex trauma, and yet they'll talk and talk and talk, and then when you get to the question, so what do you do? Well, it's always kind of like we're still looking at what to do with it. There's no really answer, because they're not asking the information, they're not asking the data the right questions, because they're still limited in that old DMS-5 Western medical paradigm. And so when you start talking about complexes, you're going to what neuroscience is proving, that Freud was actually correct. If you look at all the psychologists that we base modern psychology on, Freud actually, his hypothesis was correct, that the instinctual drives are what are driving consciousness. And And he even in I believe in 1920, wrote a paper and said that he's only talking about the death instinct, and he's talking about the sex instinct. But he said when science gets advanced enough, they'll prove that there are other instincts. And once that happens, then he would have to change everything that how he's asking the questions, because he intuited these. And so now we have that science. We actually basically predicted that, and we have that science, which are the seven Panksepian instincts. And so going back to what a trauma complex is. So if you have unconscious material, which modern psychology, because it's cognitive behavioral psychology primarily, they do not deal with what we would call analytical psychology, which is the idea of complexes, the idea of the unconscious, the idea that there are mechanisms that are actually running the what I call the dominant ego. But in cognitive behavioral therapy, it's the ego mind that they're working with, and if you can fix that, somehow that'll fix your issues. And obviously, after 100 years of cognitive behavioral therapy and throwing away the Freudian aspect, which is the complexes, we are in the worst neurotic society that's ever been. So understanding what my idea of a trauma complex is, it's more like, so if we're dealing with imagery as the main driver to heal trauma complexes, then it's easier for me to use imagery than to talk about the abstractions of it. So for instance, like if you've seen the movie Stranger Things, because this is what I wanted to talk about, or the TV show Stranger Things, the trauma complex is kind of like another world, like the upside down world. And the creatures in it are kind of hive mind. They're not quite, they use your mind, and they use your body. They control your body and they control your mind, and they use what they need in order to do whatever their particular mission is, whatever their particular motivations that our ego doesn't really know. And if you can start to see that, start that mechanism of seeing it, then you can use the same hive mind fantasy middle place where the complex is keeping separate the dominant, what I call the dominant ego mind, or the dominant ego personality, and the instinctual consciousness. So it keeps it separate. So you, as a person who's trapped in this kind of middle place of the upside down, you're never able to experience a full range of feelings about things unless the trauma complex operates it and takes your consciousness out, and you have a fight or flight reaction, or what they call emotional dysregulation. Well, your consciousness isn't there, so the emotions come out in this bizarre overcompensation type of way. And then when that isn't happening, you're overly rational. You, what they call, have a flat affect. You don't react to things at all that you should be reacting to, and you overthink everything. And so the problem isn't that one is broken, or one or the other is broken. The problem is that they're not connected, because the trauma complex is holding that fantasy place in between. And what cognitive behavioral therapy does is it tries to say that if you think your way out of that, it'll fix it. And you think your way out of it by going away from the fantasy, by going away from where the trauma complex is. And the reason I have to create the word trauma complex is because what you actually have to do is that you have to go to the trauma complex, because the same place that's sitting in that fantasy space that's creating all of this turmoil in your life is the same alchemical vessel that we'll use to undo the complex, where actually that imaginative space is now the space where the instinctual consciousness and the dominant ego mind can actually relate to one another for the first time. and you have a sense of feeling whole, and you have an access to the full range of your instinctual energy, which I call libidinal energy, which I got from Freud. Yeah, trauma complexes are very adaptive for us in the situation. If you're with complex trauma or developmental trauma as a child, Professor Mark Solms, he says that trauma is instincts that are prematurely and illegitimately turned on, right? So you have this full range of instincts that are actually your consciousness, not your ego mind. The instincts tell your ego mind what to look for. If you turn your ego mind off, you still have a person that can interact with the universe. If you turn your instincts off, you have a dead person. Because we have the interface between a dominant ego consciousness and the instincts, it's that ability of the dominant ego mind to dissociate from the instincts that allow us for a short time to be adaptable when the instincts cannot handle a new situation. So it's the dissociative ability of the prefrontal cortex, or the dominant ego personality, or the dominant ego mind, to dissociate that creates the ability for the instincts to be able to adapt to environmental things and to develop at different times that it needs to. So let's say that the instincts are developmental. They're all there in the beginning, and I believe that they're all there in the beginning. But they anticipate certain things. Like your instincts, even in the beginning, are anticipating that one day you are going to reach puberty. And then if you reach puberty, they're anticipating that you need to learn how to relate to someone else so you can have a baby. Instincts are very simplistic this way. They're not politically correct. They just do what they need to do. And so there's developmental, there's time, they're time coded to a certain degree, and they have to, and they're adaptable. In an animal, the instincts aren't necessarily adaptable, but because we have the interface between a dominant ego consciousness and the instincts, it's that ability of the dominant ego mind to dissociate from the instincts that allow us for a short time to be adaptable when the instincts cannot handle a new situation. So it's the dissociative ability of the prefrontal cortex, or the dominant ego personality, or the dominant ego mind, to dissociate that creates the ability for the instincts to be able to adapt to environmental things and to develop at different times that it needs to.